just looks like we might be heading into this perfect storm because this 25% tariffs on anyone trading with Iran, it seems that China would be the primary target of this, and that would restart the economic war with the Chinese. As you said, the Russians and Chinese would likely back Iran, at least indirectly, with intelligence, weapons. But also, if there is a war, wouldn't there be some opportunism? I feel like if the U.S. gets um, held up in the Middle East, that the Russians would then feel a bit more confident in terms of retaliating against any European provocations. I just saw 2 days ago that the British Foreign Ministry or Defense Ministry was making a point that, oh, well, we're developing missiles now which can go 500 kilometers with 200 kilogram warheads, so we can start the bombing Moscow. I mean, how at some point the Russians we will see it as irresponsible not to retaliate because it only emboldens the Europeans, because in Europe now it's kind of accepted as the normal. We can strike Russia all we want, and we just call it helping Ukraine. But it looks as if now that the Russians are coming in a stronger position, they're not going to accept this anymore.
I think that's entirely valid. And I think of the three, when you look at Germany, France, and Great Britain, that are the principal culprits responsible for what goes on from Ukraine into Russia, they're not alone because, let's face it, we still provide targeting data and information. Our overhead surveillance is still critical to all of that. But of the three, they really, really have had it with the British because they know how weak the British really are. The British have nothing to fight with. They're in terrible shape. They don't hate the British people, but they hate that damn government that is talking and behaving the way it is. Now, the interesting part is they seem to want to challenge us over Greenland. That's about as ridiculous as the Russians or Chinese trying to challenge us in the Caribbean. So hopefully the British and the French will shelve that dumb idea. And they're all talking about, well, America is bringing an end to NATO. They don't seem to understand that that's fine as far as this administration is concerned. We have been tired of the Europeans and their demands on us for a very long time. The problem is we can't seem to shed the Russia hate problem, which I think is entirely an artificial construct that sits in Washington as a result of powerful lobbies. The American population doesn't share that view. They don't know much about it. Their knee-jerk reaction is to think, oh, it must be the Soviets again. Oh, that's right, it's not the Soviet Union anymore. I mean, Americans don't know much about what's beyond their borders, let's face it. You know that from having been here. But nevertheless, it's not a systemic problem in the United States. But I think the Russians, if they're pushed, they could respond. And I think the British ought to seriously examine their fragility, their vulnerability. The Russians aren't going to attack London and blow anything up, but there are lots of military targets that could easily be brought under attack and absolutely annihilated, and there's not a damn thing the British can do about it. Now, there's something else, and this is something I've been working on with some friends, and I'm going to try and make this presentation in the near future, but I'm trying to get people to think a little differently about our relationship with Russia, and that's about no first use. This idea has been kicked around many times. JFK, before he was killed, after his experience during the Cuban Missile Crisis, wanted to pursue a course that I think would have ultimately led to something like that. The Chinese have a declared no first use policy, but we dismiss that because, after all, their arsenal isn't that large. Well, it's actually growing, and it's very potentially lethal. But we have many nuclear powers today: Pakistan, India, Israel, North Korea, Russia, China, Great Britain, France. I think, given the dangers that we're talking about in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, if we cannot come to any sort of agreement that would bring those conflicts to a head, perhaps we can come to some sort of arrangement that prevents the use of nuclear weapons. Because once a nuclear weapon is used, the escalation is inevitable. Every study that we've done, every model that we've looked at inevitably leads to escalation because every side decides, well, if I don't use it, I'll lose it. So I'm going to use it. And this is being discussed for many years behind the scenes. I think President Trump, who's talked a great deal about his qualifications for the Nobel Peace Prize, most of the time that evokes laughter. But if he were to step forward and say, we can't solve the Ukraine problem today, but we can at least prevent Armageddon now, and look at it from that standpoint and stand up for no first use, and then sit with Moscow and Beijing, and then ultimately India, Pakistan, and the rest, and put together an agreement under which everybody says, none of us will be the first to use a nuclear weapon under any circumstances. I think that could be very good. It would also promote a new way forward on the Korean Peninsula, because I know that the Republic of South Korea wants to put this away, wants that to go away, the nuclear problem, but they'd also like us to leave because we're now increasingly seen as a catalyst for war on the Korean Peninsula. We're no longer seen as a security blanket that we once were. So I would hope that the president will think about that. We're going to make a push in the very near future about that. I hope to talk about that in Vancouver at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference that's coming up at the end of January, 25 through 27 January. But that's the only thing I can think of right now that would circumvent this sort of jammed up diplomatic mess and get to something that is really critical to the survival of the planet, something that we could agree on, I hope.
Well, the START treaty is due to expire next month, if I'm not mistaken, and it seemed to some point that Trump was prepared to make the nuclear weapons a key issue. He talked about denuclearizing the relationship between the U.S., Russia, and China. And indeed, if you want to go with the largest nuclear powers, then well, this this would be a good approach. But I haven't heard much talk about it lately. Instead, I've heard talks about increasing the U.S. the military budget to $1.5 trillion, which well could have imposed. I'm sure they find the money, but this will have some consequences. So
Well, there's somebody named William Hartung that you should consider interviewing. I don't know if you've interviewed him or not. But William Hartung, who writes frequently at the Quincy Institute, talks about the budget, and he makes the point that this leads to more foreign interventions, and it's inherently escalatory in terms of moving us down the road to greater violence. I think that's part of it, but something that most people don't understand inside or outside of the United States is that a large part of our defense budget is fixed. It involves the costs of medical care. That may seem, you say, well, why is that a big deal? Well, we have a lot of veterans. We have a lot of wounded. We have a lot of people who were killed and their families have suffered. There's a lot of money in that for that purpose, dealing with those issues. Then on top of that, you have pensions. Huge numbers of people are retired because we've gone to this quote unquote all volunteer force. That's very expensive. So at the end of the day, that's a big chunk of the budget. Now, moving beyond that, an awful lot of money that he's talking about will not produce the dream military establishment he talks about. You're just going to get more of what you got, because ultimately that's what the generals and the admirals want. And the people on the Hill don't pay any attention. They just want to spend money. If I take you to Washington and walk you through the Senate and the House, and you ask these people, what do you do here? They say, well, we spend money. If we're not spending money, we have nothing to do. Now, when you say that, then they also look at the budget as an opportunity to do what? Aggrandize themselves, their donors, the various corporate structures that are rooted in their districts and states. And so they start piling on in this massive feeding frenzy at the public trough. So just because before you add more money doesn't necessarily mean that you're buying more real capability. Now, you just saw us go into and out of Venezuela in what everybody is describing as this brilliant operation. Well, it was. And we have remarkable capabilities in the special operations world. But special operations don't win wars. They're a niche capability, and you have to have an environment conducive to the use of special operations. That worked very well in Venezuela. I wouldn't try it in North Korea. I wouldn't necessarily try it in China or Russia. Right now, Iran, maybe, but even there, you're going to have problems. And then we haven't really told everybody just how much money we spent to buy off key members of the Venezuelan government and security forces. So what I'm saying is that you're liable to see a lot more money go into those things, but you may not necessarily see anything that fundamentally dramatically improves your position in a strategic sense. And then finally, you have the problem of the debasement of our currency, because all of this is push button money. It comes out of thin air.
Yeah, the economic crisis coming, I think, is going to come as unfortunately as a surprise, which will complicate all of these conflicts, which are now seemingly playing out at the same time. So yes, interesting times ahead. Well, Colonel, as always, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Glenn. Bye-bye.